Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck guide. This one is 4 Color Elementals. As a friendly reminder, if you do like informative modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. Welcome to deck guide number 2 for Broken Modern Horizons 2 decks .deck. First one being, obviously, is it Murktide. This deck was obviously enabled by the printing of the pitch elementals in Modern Horizons 2 to be paired with Risen Reef, and has kind of overtaken 4 Color Omnath Control as the preferred mid-range control deck of the format. It does approach the format a little bit differently than 4 Color Control. Obviously, you've given up some of your upper planeswalkers and counterspells and traded them for creatures and a little bit more interaction with your blink abilities. So this deck is based around obviously Urion and also the card Ephemerate. Ephemerate allows you to abuse all of your comes into play abilities off of your creatures, which we'll get to here in a second. And might be the most powerful card in the deck outside of your planeswalkers like Wrenn and 6 and Teferi Time Raveler. Just the sheer ability to rebuy your creatures, reuse their comes into play abilities, and just kind of overwhelm your opponent with card advantage. This is one of the decks that's basically predicated on outgrinding almost every deck in the format. There are a few decks that can go over the top of it. There are a few decks that can go underneath of it and kind of ignore what it's doing, but we'll get into that a bit later. As I said, the key difference to this version versus the 4 Color Control decks, which we'll do at some other point, is Risen Reef. Whenever Risen Reef or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it on the battlefield. If it's not, put it in your hand. This pairs with the rest of the deck, which most of the key cards in this deck are elementals, and just kind of, despite being a little bit slow for the modern format, does kind of overwhelm your opponent with card advantage. And then when you get to compare it with the free pitch elementals, the speed isn't as much relevant, especially against creature-based decks, which will be normally the ones that would overwhelm you. Beyond that, as far as your creatures, Omnath Locus of Creation might be the most powerful whenever it comes into play. It replaces itself, and then it has 3 different landfall triggers. The first one gains you 4 life. The second one allows you to get 4 mana, which are the 4 colors that it's cast for, ironically. And then the third one, if you happen to do that, which is deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control, which can really only happen if you happen to hit a land off of Risen Reef or if you've saved a fetch land from a previous turn. And then beyond that, you have the duo of Solitude and Fury. Fury obviously comes down, deals 4 damage to any number of planeswalkers or creatures, total combined. So you can have it deal 2 damage to a planeswalker, 2 damage to a creature, etc. Solitude, this is kind of one of the things that have kind of led to the decline of the tribal decks that were left in the format before Modern Horizons 2. Never comes into play, it's basically Swords to Plowshares. Then you can evoke it, and then if you happen to cast it or blink it with Ephemerate, you also get a 3/2 lifelinker, which can close out a lot of games, especially against decks like Burn and such, especially when paired with Omnath's life gain. Beyond that, you are a Wrenn and 6 Teferi Time Raveler deck. Wrenn and 6 helps you fix all of your mana problems, and often can deal with annoying threats like Ragavan. Come down turn 2, kill a Ragavan, and then start, rebuying you a bunch of lands, as this deck is very mana hungry. Cannot say enough about Wrenn and 6. Most hands with Wrenn and 6 against any type of non-over-the-top or combo deck, it tends to be very good. Then Teferi Time Raveler. This is both a value card in this deck, an anti-control card, and an anti-combo card, all wrapped up into one for 3 mana. Its +1 ability allows you to cast sorceries, which isn't very relevant in this deck, but you do have prismatic endings that you can get. Its -3 allows you to bounce things to their opponent's hand, which you can bounce problematic artifact, creature, or enchantment of your opponents, or with all your various triggers, you can just bounce one of your own elementals and get a ton of value off of it that way. But this also serves as a hate card against opposing counterspell decks, along with your Cavernous Souls and your mana base, so making controls playing a little bit worse against you for blue-white control or 4 color control. And also, Murktide makes their life pretty miserable if this happens to resolve, bouncing their Murktides and such. And also serves as a hate card against 2 of your more difficult matchups. Rhinos isn't as difficult, but Living End especially can be a difficult matchup for this deck if you're not careful. So this is kind of a built-in hate card in the main deck for that. As far as the rest of the slots you see in the deck, You have your ephemerates we've already touched on, lightning bolts and unholy heats, as well as prismatic endings as your different forms of interaction. While you're not going to trigger delirium very often, you can sometimes get this up to 6. Lightning bolt, obviously very important, especially for 1-drop creatures, as that is one thing that can let your opponent get underneath you. And then 4 copies of prismatic ending allow you to pretty much answer anything else you want to. From 1 through 4, and if you happen to have an abundant growth, 1 through 5 sometimes as well. And then Oath of Nissa, just kind of a tie-in card, allows you to play your planeswalkers off of your awkward mana starts, like say you have a Cavern of Souls and a Triome. This allows you to cast a run in 6. And then kind of your filler slots, things like Icewind Coatl, just comes down. It kind of pairs with the value engine of the deck. While not being an elemental itself, when playing some number of snowlands, you can potentially trade it with some bigger creatures later in the game. And that allows you to kind of keep the ball rolling with your things. And then Eldamari's Call is kind of your silver bullet package getter. There are certain matchups where certain cards are very powerful, and oftentimes you're going to be shaving this in, against fair matchups like the Mirror Match or Is It Murktide, but when you need a silver bullet, like say Obsidian Charmaw against Tron, or Endurance against Living End, this card will definitely pull its weight in those circumstances, and might be one of the most underrated cards in the deck, but something you will board out quite a bit in the fairer matchups. Speaking of bullets, you have Endurance, another pitch elemental. You can use to kind of shut off your opponent's graveyard, whether it's against Murktide decks, whether against Living End, whether against Dredge. It's very nice to have these as a silver bullet in the main deck. Then you have Obsidian Charmaw, which comes down, blows up a land, obviously with the various blink things you have in your deck, whether it be Ephemerates or Yorion out of the companion slot. Allows you to slow down Tron and such, while also disrupting other decks, it can be a little bit tricky in the early game if you happen to get this going early against, say, another 4-color control deck, or against Tron and such. Also can mess with Titan's mana a little bit. And then Titania, Protector of Argoth. This is a very high risk, high reward card. As a one-of, whenever it comes down, you can start mixing 5/3s if lands go in the graveyard. Basically, every time you're cracking a fetch land, you're getting a 5/3. So ideally, much like Omnath, you want to hold this in the situations where you can kind of take advantage of it. Omnath, one of the dangerous things about this is playing it exposed without having a second one or an immediate fetch land to get some value off of it. It's one of the more difficult cards, one of the more rewarding and broken cards in the deck, but also can be tricky. Sometimes you don't want to play it in open removal, especially if you have the ability the next turn to chain off with a fetch land. Although, sometimes if you have 2 copies, just playing it on turn 3 or turn 4, forcing your opponent to answer it, and then casting the next one, and then having a busted turn where you go, say, Omnath, fetch land, crack the fetch land, get 5 mana, play a Fury or something, and kind of overwhelm for your opponent, especially if you have a Risen Reef start thrown in there. And then finally, you have Abundant Growth, which comes in, draws you a card. Yet another thing, this deck just draws card after card after card, and then, helps you fix your mana for all of the different things you're trying to cast. And finally, the mana base, your 4-color mana base, fetches and shocks. No big surprise there. You have a couple Triomes in here to hold it all together. You have snow-covered basics in this particular version because of Icewind Coatl. Once again, if you don't run Coatl or run some other package, maybe you can get away with playing other basics. And then, the other utility land in here besides Boseiju, which we'll touch on in a minute, is Cavern of Souls. Allows you to power through the various different counterspell decks, whether it be 4-color control or Is It Murktide, which are the big ones right now. And then Boseiju just gives you outs to random things like Blood Moon and such. It could be problematic otherwise, although these decks often play a Blood Moon effect in the sideboard, which we'll get to in a minute. And that's pretty much the main deck of this particular version that's done well recently. Sideboard, you get some, obviously you have access to your companion. Yorion, really should touch on this, reason to be playing 80-card elementals as opposed to 60-card version with Kahira. Allows you to abuse the blink elements. Obviously with things like Ephemerate, you can, Yorion, blink Yorion, reset your whole board, kind of go nuts from there. Very powerful effect overall. Kind of a hard card to argue with, and is probably the most powerful remaining companion in the format, especially with the banning of Lurrus. Some of the other cards, Veil of Summer, this is primarily for discards decks, and you can bring it in against counterspells, although it can be a little bit redundant against counterspell decks, as you already have Cavern of Souls, Teferi Time Raveler. You might want to bring a couple of these in to answer those, but it's primarily for discard spell decks. Dovin's Veto, pretty much here for combo and control, keeping your opponent's difficult planeswalkers from resolving or dealing with a problematic thing like, say, a Calibrated Blast, a key card out of Tron, etc. Very powerful spell in those kind of matchups. Meddling Mage, this is pretty much one of your silver bullets for single card strategies. So against Amulet Naming, Primeval Titan, against Living End, etc. This is one of those things that when you pair it with Eldamari's Call, it makes a lot of your difficult matchups in the post-board games a lot easier. Knight of Autumn, this is a kind of a pseudo-hate card against any type of Hammer Time deck or any type of Urza Saga decks or any type of random artifact or enchantment deck you might run into. Magnus of the Moon, this kind of gives you outs against some of your other problematic matchups. This used to be played in the main deck of some of these lists, but Obsidian Charmaw is kind of taking over that main deck slot. It's a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier on your own mana. This card does require a little bit of setup with your mana, whether it's fetching basics or your Abundant Growth kind of bailing you out. Still a very powerful effect against Amulet and Tron specifically. 3rd and 4th copies of Endurance. Obviously, Living End is a rough matchup if you're not prepared, which this deck clearly is. And then, this allows you to have also play against random things like Reanimator that might pop up from here and there. 4th copy of Fury for any type of creature matchups. Chalice of the Void. This is one that kind of ebbs and flows. Primary thing it tags is the Cascade decks, whether it be Rhinos or Living End, but it also can come in against things like Death Shadow, Burn, etc., and kind of get them a little bit. And finally, you have your go over the top element, and that is Emrakul the Promised End. This is here primarily for the mirror match and for 4-color control. It's just kind of your card to go over the top in those matchups. Alright, taking a look at a slightly different list. This list, as you'll see, doesn't vary a whole lot from the one that we just discussed. However, it does contain a couple of other cards that I'd like to discuss. First one being Eternal Witness, which allows you to rebuy all of your various different things. Especially plays nicely with Ephemerate, allowing you to rebuy all of your elementals, or allowing you to rebuy your Urion if your opponent happens to kill it. And then one of the other new additions that some versions run is running Jamir's Garden over the Ketria Triome that was previously thing. As the red mana isn't particularly important, and Bant really is the core colors of this deck. So, switch out there. Once again, running 30 lands. Nothing too specific about the main deck other than that. As you're seeing a lot of uniformity for an 80-card deck, which is kind of interesting. Sideboard, instead of the 4th Fury, they chose to put the Endurance on the board to be able to play the copy of Eternal Witness that we're talking about. A lot of the same other cards, basically the same sideboard that we just saw, other than Obsidian Charmaw was also moved to the sideboard as opposed to the Magus. This person obviously respects Tron and Amulet a little bit less, but wanted to be more ready for some of the other matchups. Maybe play some of the other grindy matchups like Murktide and 4-color control a little bit more. So I want to highlight this list as a little bit of a different variation. This is more akin to the older school elemental lists that really were kind of, when they first came out, the Flamekin Harbinger basic lists. While this is a Yorion version, it's a little bit different in the cards that it plays. Flamekin Harbinger kind of takes the place of Eldamari's Call. A little bit slower because it puts it on the top of your library as opposed to in your hand. And this deck obviously requires 4 colors of mana, so you're playing the full 4 Cavern of Souls. And this deck is a little bit more elemental-centric than some of the other ones even. And you're still playing a lot of the same things. You're playing Bolt, you're playing Ephemerate, you're still playing Abundant Growth, you're still playing Eldamari's Call. But your bullets are a little bit different. You get to play things like Unsettled Mariner to make your opponent interacting with your creatures a little bit more difficult. This one's playing Fulminator Mage as opposed to Obsidian Charmaw, simply because it's a little bit of a cheaper of an elemental to get. Obviously you don't have a way to rebuy it, but sometimes just blowing up a land or two. Subtlety is a way to interact with planeswalkers and creatures, and while you don't have a ton of blue cards to pitch to it, obviously you have Yurion to have access to. Which is yet another thing about Yurion I forgot to mention, is it gets to pitch to your Solitudes, so, yet another reason to play that companion. And then you get to play your Titanias, etc. So this list is a little bit different with the Flamekin Harbingers and such. Oftentimes this actually isn't a turn 1 play. Sometimes you'll play it as like a turn 1 blocker for a Ragavan, put a little bit of pressure on your opponent, but it gives you another tutorable way to kind of attack your opponent with whatever tool you need with your elemental packages. The sideboard's a little bit unique. They play a third copy of Beseiju. Obviously, they hate losing to whatever type of artifact or enchantment. Just kind of insane that you get to play your artifact and enchantment hate in your sideboard. 4 copies of Damping Sphere. Somebody really hates Amulet and Tron. Also, randomly good against a deck like Storm and such, if that should happen to pop up. Slows down some of the other combo decks in the format, but 4 copies of Force of Negation. Interesting, I guess, because you don't really play that many blue cards. You play Risen Reef, Subtlety, Omnath, Teferi, and Urion if you want to fetch it out of your companion zone. But it is a way to interact with combo and such on the stack. 2 additional copies of Endurance for the graveyard decks that we've already talked about. Engineered Explosives, a fine catch-all. A little bit slow for what this deck's trying to do, but you know, when you are a slow, grindy deck, I guess you can kind of get away with that. And obviously, it's still playing the Emrakul, the Promised End, for the kind of the grindier matchups. But I did want to highlight, you know, a different style of deck that was out there. One of the feedbacks I received about the Golgari Yawgmoth deck is that I didn't highlight some of the other lesser types of the lesser played types of the archetype out there. So I figured that I would pull this one up, since that was a fun one-of list that I found with the Flaming Harbingers. And then finally, this list, once again, not a whole lot different. You know, you're seeing a lot of the same cards over and over again. This one's deciding to take a little bit of a more defensive stance with Wall of Omens in the list, which I found interesting. You know, this is a card like Icefang Quaddle. Some people would play that, etc. Wall of Omens is a decent blocker against any type of aggressive decks that you might be expecting. Pretty good at blanking Ragavans and such in the early turns. This one also plays 4 copies of Oath of Nissa, which makes your Remnant 6s and Teferis that much easier to deal with. Only 29 lands, not sure how I feel about that, but with the 4 Oath of Nissas, I guess you can get away with playing a little bit lower of a land count. Also playing 1 copy of Urion in the main, in addition to the companion slot, kind of sick. Definitely you can get some value off of that. Not really playing a lot of bullets other than the Endurance I see, so this one is much more of a almost clean 4-of deck, other than it seemed to have shaved 2 Furies for a Urion and Endurance, but once again, Endurance, very powerful effect to have access to. Sideboard, it moves some of the Lightning Bolts to the sideboard. It's also running Ether Gust, which is not a card you see a lot in the format, although there is a lot of things you can hit with it. It can come in against Murktide, not the best, as their biggest threats are obviously blue, but you know, it can come in again against the Mirror Match, come in against Tron, etc. Titan, another one that's pretty good against. Veil of Summer, we've already touched on. Bolts, we've already touched on in the main deck. Magnus the Moon, once again, nothing terribly different, but once again, it is interesting to see how often this card pops up, despite the restrictions it puts on your own mana base. Force of Vigor, again, another card that you have options to whenever you have so many green cards in your deck. This is pretty good against the various Hammer decks, pretty good against any type of you know, Urza Saga decks that are still out there. Then Foundation Breaker, kind of a nice elemental that you can blink with whatever else is going on to kind of deal with your opponent's doing. And then once again, the Emrakul showing up as a go over the top mechanism to kind of attack the deck. So how do you beat this deck? It's kind of difficult. You know, there are decks that, you know, go over the top of it, whether it be Amulet, Titan, and Tron can both go over the top of it, although, as you've seen, it does have tools to fight those decks. Or you can just try to grind with it. Murktide is probably a bit of a dog to the deck, but can grind with it if you're a good Murktide pilot. The Mirror Matches, obviously, whether it be 4-color control, 4-color elementals are also decks that, you know, can kind of get into some snowball games. And then the kind of off-the-wall decks out there, whether you're a Neo brand deck that, you know, you're still piloting that deck with its different changes that have come up. If you're piloting Belcher, if you're piloting Calibrated Blast, all these various different off-the-wall combo decks. Most notably Living End and Rhinos both have a reasonable matchup against it, although they can, you know, have the tools to grind through your Rhinos or just outright ignore your Living End. You know, between Endurances, Meddling Mages, Teferis, still they have a lot of tools to play against those matchups. The one card that, like, hard hurts this deck is Torpor Orb. Now, obviously, if you look at these main decks, you're seeing copies of Boseiju, you're seeing copies of Prismatic Ending. So they have outs to those cards, so it's not a hard lock like it used to be before Boseiju was printed, when they just really had Prismatic Ending to answer it. But that is like the one sideboard card that can shut down a lot of what's going on. But the other side of that effect is then they can evoke their elementals and get these cheap, ridiculously powerful creatures going. So, you know, even when you're playing Torpor Orb, you know, there is some pluses and the minuses to that as well. You would think a card like Blood Moon would be pretty good against them. But as you're seeing, they play Blood Moon, so its effectiveness is kind of dubious. They do play basics. Their main can be a little bit stretched in the early game especially, so, you know, maybe a deck like Ponza can come back up and attack them. But, you know, there really isn't a lot of good ways to attack this deck, as this is really kind of the king of mid-range / control decks, other than maybe 4-color control. So you either have to go over the top with something like Amulet or Tron, or just ignore what they're doing with some type of combo deck. Burn and like really low to the ground aggressive decks can kind of get in there. But once again, they have tools, they have Solitude, they have Omnath. So one of the reasons why this deck continues to be as powerful and be around as much as it is just simply the fact that it's powerful. It basically has answers to everything it wants to, and everything draws a card. Especially if you have a Risen Reef in play. Literally everything draws a card. It's really kind of hard to beat a deck that literally just draws cards stapled to everything it does. So, once again, deck's powerful, whether you think it should be in the format or not. You know, what card would you ban? Maybe Ephemerate, maybe Omnath if you really wanted to hurt the deck. It's one of the few decks that are capable of fighting toe-to-toe with Murktide. And as I said when Lurrus got banned, you know, you're really taking those decks out of the format. You're going to end up with 4-color piles, and you're going to end up with Murktide. And, well, with the exception of some Cascade decks, that's pretty much what you're ending up with in the format right now. So, maybe they'll do something with this deck. But, overall, very powerful deck. One of the few things holding it down, even from probably better results, is the price tag of the deck. So, deck's very powerful, deck's very strong, very consistent in what it does. It's one of those decks you need to be aware of, and if you have the option to play it, I would certainly pick up and play this deck. The few times I've played variants of it or played against it, it's always a blast to play with or against. Although, if you're a Tron player, the look on their face when they see a Tron land is... But, overall, this deck is a blast to play. I have nothing against it. It's a lot of fun, and hope to see you for the next video. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and see you in the next video.